Welcome to the Podcast for Inquiry, brought to you by the Centre for Inquiry Canada, a national educational charity supporting your community for reason, compassion, and secular humanist values. You have answers, we have questions. I'm your host, Leslie Rosenblood, board member and secular chair for CFIC. Welcome. In today's episode with James Turk, we discuss free expression and why it is important. We also discuss the marketplace of ideas and its applicability in a free and democratic society that supports free expression. We talk about censorship and why it generally doesn't work and may be counterproductive. And at the close of the episode, I provide the most compelling argument I know for additional constraints on free expression and his reaction on what we can do to address this social ill. Without further ado, I bring you my conversation with James Turk. James Turk, thank you for coming on the Podcast for Inquiry. I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
Well, I'm grateful for the invitation and look forward to talking with you.
So, our topic today is about free expression and free speech. And obviously, this is something that is important to you. But before we get into the details, can you please tell me what free expression is? And also, I think what's important, what it isn't, so that we know that what we're talking about today.
Okay, yes. Well, free expression refers actually to two things. One, the right of all of us to express ourselves. And we use the term free expression as opposed to free speech because expression can be more than spoken words. It can be writing, it can be artistic endeavors, whether it be paintings or plays or whatever. So expression covers the broad range of things. It also covers not only the words, but the manner of expressing. So I can say certain words and you can say, well, you have to say them respectfully or you can't be angry. No. Expression is both the content of what you're expressing and the manner in which you're expressing it. So that's one half of free expression. The other half of free expression is the right to hear. So that free expression covers not only your right to express your views, but my right to hear them and to hear others' views. And you don't have the expressive right to stop me from hearing who I want to hear. So free expression has both those aspects.
Okay. And why is that important? Like now that we know that it is, you think it's why should we care about free expression?
Okay, I think there are four reasons why it's important. First of all, freedom of expression, the right to speak, the right to hear, is how we all become who we are. I have my grandchildren visiting me, a little 3-year-old, and he'll have ideas. He'll say them. I'll say, no, not that or this. He'll think about that and respond or not as he will. And through our whole lives, we do that. As we're doing this conversation, my understanding of some of these issues may well change as a result of our conversation today. So it's that ability to share our ideas, to get feedback on our ideas, to think about it, to change. That's only possible because of free expression. So it's what some people refer to as self-realization. It's how we become who we are and change who we are over the course of our lives. So that's one important aspect. A second important aspect is the advancement of knowledge. I've worked most of my life in universities, and much of what we understand as truth today, or what we understand as the right theories or the right way of understanding phenomena, 100 or 200 years ago may have been unimaginable, seen as heretical, as wrong. And so the ability to raise questions about conventional wisdom or disciplinary knowledge and to question it, to talk about it, to criticize it, to evaluate is how we advance knowledge. And so expressive freedom is really fundamental to our ability to do that. A third dimension, and in many ways I view the most important, is it's essential for democracy. Democracy, in my view, is not so much about the rule of law as about an unending conversation in a society about what's legitimate and what's not legitimate. And that conversation is not brought to an end by a majority government at a certain point. A majority government can pass laws. We're obligated to follow those laws, but we're also free to express our opposition to them and to try to change them. And so that ongoing public discourse is at the heart of democracy, and free expression is all that makes it possible. And I guess the fourth reason I think is also very important is I think expressive freedom is essential for achieving social justice. Um, One way to put it is powerful, rich, cisgendered white men don't need constitutional protections generally to have their views heard. They have plenty of ways in which to get their views heard. But often the protections for free expression to challenge conventional wisdom is particularly important for those who are minorities or are marginalized, whose views may not be welcome or may um, raise questions that people don't want to deal with. And our ability to have a more just society depends on not only free expression, but free expression being a reality for everyone and being protected, especially for those who are marginalized. So those would be the four reasons I think free expression freedom is so important to a society.
Well, that's great, and there's so much to delve into in each of those categories, and I would like to do so. Actually, I'll come back to. I think I want to come back to each of them, but you mentioned on number four social justice, so I'll start there. But I'll come back to knowledge, democracy, and personal growth, and a lot of what I've seen of calls to limit free expression are coming from those who are deeply concerned about social justice. So advocates for limiting free speech from that perspective argue that the open market of speech allows for those that currently are in power to discourage minority perspectives. For example, bigots get a loud voice, and then they use free speech as a shield while they disseminate their noxious views. So until parity or equality or protections are achieved, a lot of social justice activists are seeking protection in the form of safe spaces, trigger warnings, disinvitations, deplatforming for those people that hold. Let's say there's even general agreement that for those that hold noxious views. So, how do we approach uh, this? What seems to be a sincere commitment of yours to social justice with free expression?
Well, in your question are a whole bunch of things that need to be untangled.
Yeah, well, I this isn't a simple topic.
No, it is not. Uh, First of all, I mean, historically, free expression has been championed by marginalized groups. If one traces through the history of the American civil rights movement or the history of anti colonial struggles in India and elsewhere, expressive freedom was recognized as essential to those seeking justice because they were trying to speak in an environment where the majority didn't want to hear them. And in the civil rights movement in the United States, they would point to the First Amendment and so forth, and often were silenced, and courts would come down with bad decisions against them. But the recognition that expressive freedom was a fundamental right that they needed in order to be able to be successful was recognized. And so it's rather different than, as you noted, many today who think that, well, the way to deal with noxious comments, with transphobic views, with racist views, is to silence them. Um, it comes from a desirable place. There's an honest belief that if we can stop the expression of those views, we will stop the racism, we will stop the transphobia. There's just no evidence that that works. So, um, you know, there's no indication, for example, that the strong hate speech laws that exist in Germany or in France or in the UK, much stronger than our hate speech laws, have resulted in any less um, anti Semitism or Islamophobia or transphobia than exists in Canada. In other words, racism, for example, is a serious curse in our society that we have to deal with. And a lot of people think the way you deal with that is by censoring racist speech. And not only is that there's no evidence that that is an effective way to deal with racism, but it also gives the false impression that you actually are dealing with racism by doing that instead of challenging the things that have to be challenged if we're going to get away from the kind of racism that's endemic in our society. We have a fundamentally flawed criminal justice system. We have rampant economic inequality and social inequality. Those things are the much more challenging aspects of what we have to address if we're going to get rid of racism. Saying, well, stopping racist speech, stopping so and so from speaking at this event, or saying that these words cannot be said, um, not only undermines the broader expressive freedom, but is also unsuccessful as a way of dealing with the fundamental problem. And so I think there's been recognition of that historically, although at the moment there are a lot of people who still believe that censorship is a route to getting rid of some of these evils in our society. I don't think that's the case. And I don't think there's any evidence that it's the case.
Okay, thank you. I, another key uh, reason that free expression is important that you mentioned is for the dissemination or the advancement of knowledge. The the theory of evolution has been well established for well over a century, but yet creationists are still pushing for equal time in the classrooms. We've known that the Earth is a sphere for centuries, but yet flat earthers are holding annual conventions in the United States. Uh, it seems that the advancement of knowledge as a defense of free expression depends on the assumption that the free market or the open market of ideas, which posits that good ideas push out bad ideas. Does that does that model actually reflect reality? Because it seems that there's many counterexamples that would point to the dissemination of bad ideas just lead to bad ideas being accepted.
A lot of people who are proponents of free expression talk, as you suggest, as in terms of, well, there's a marketplace of ideas. We have to protect that marketplace, and the good ideas will rise to the top, and the bad ideas will disappear. Unfortunately, that market works no more equitably than economic markets. Um, so I'm never one to justify expressive freedom in terms of the marketplace of ideas, in the sense that um, there's no reason necessarily or there's no empirical evidence that the best ideas will necessarily rise to the top. If that were the case, Donald Trump wouldn't have been president of the United States. All sorts of terrible stuff wouldn't be happening. On the other hand, in the absence of the ability to express your ideas, the possibility of progressive change is significantly diminished. So it's not that by a faith that the marketplace of ideas will result in good happening, but the denial of that marketplace, the denial of the right to express your ideas, is an assurance that good things will not be happening.
Well, yeah, okay. So when you say that it's that required for the advancement of knowledge, I assume that you were referring to the marketplace of ideas. But what you're saying is that at least the good ideas or the right ideas have a chance in a culture or in a society with free expression, and the right or good ideas have no chance whatsoever if free expression is curtailed to a significant extent.
Well, I mean, there are lots of examples. In the 1950s, I think it was, Joseph Stalin embraced a crackpot biologist named Lysenko, and and indicated that, or ruled that, only Lysenkoism could be taught as biology in the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union went from a major scientific, in the field of biology, a major scientific player in the world, to almost the laughing stock, because there was no ability to challenge Lysenkoism within Soviet biological science. The right to challenge conventional wisdom, disciplinary knowledge in whatever field, is essential to the advancement of knowledge. Now, a lot of times, what's the challenge may be with crackpot ideas. Uh, I don't think that there's much serious debate among the majority that flat Earth theories are silly. I don't think, despite the existence of the Discovery Institute and a strong evangelical support for creationism, that there's much confusion in the scientific world about the theory of evolution. Uh, so the fact that we tolerate that free expression allows what we see as crackpot ideas to be articulated shouldn't be confused with the fact that they dominate. In the university world, where we're trying, where there is the expert knowledge that tries to define what are the boundaries of what's acceptable or what's known or what's truthful or what's coherent or what's theoretically sensible. We're the boundaries. There are boundaries. There are disciplinary boundaries. Um, and those disciplinary boundaries themselves can be challenged, but nevertheless, if I'm a professor of biology and I go through a religious conversion over these holidays and become an evangelical Christian and decide to embrace creationism, I can't go into my classroom and teach creationism as science. Um, so that we're in this peculiar but I think important context where what is knowledge is always socially determined. It's socially determined within a broad disciplinary scope. So what is our state of knowledge about biology is determined largely by those who are engaged in biological science. But we always have the freedom to challenge that. Um, and sometimes those challenges can be harmful, as when the Catholic Church went after Galileo and said his notion that the earth revolved around the sun was heretical and wrong, and he would be tortured unless he abandoned it. But generally, uh, that ability to question knowledge does result over time in an awareness in the advancement of knowledge. I'm going to give you one example. For a very long time, it was understood that ulcers were created by stress, by gastric juices that were, and two biologists at two gastroenterologists in Texas, associated with Baylor University, developed a theory that this is really wrong. That ulcers are caused by a bacterium, and since you can't do biological experiments on humans, they had no way of proving this. They made their cases, they laid it out, they were treated as foolish. If it weren't for notions of tenure and so forth, they probably would have been fired. And one of them finally said, "Well, I guess I'm gonna have to prove it because I had my system. I have no ulcers, whatever." He took the bacterium and developed very serious ulcers. And now the world understands that ulcers are caused by bacteria. And these two guys who were on the verge of losing their jobs received the Nobel Prize for their work. So it's having a society that's tolerant of difference, of the right of people. I think, as you put it at the beginning, the right to think differently, as important. But that doesn't mean we abandon all standards and therefore flat Earth theory has the same status as understanding the world is round. But it means that there is the right to say that, but there's also the right to criticize it. And a lot of deplatforming, for example, uh, confuses sometimes where there's genuine deplatforming, where you are silencing somebody and not allowing them to speak, from other situations where people vigorously protest ideas that they dislike. And the ability to vigorously protest ideas is a fundamental part of expressive freedom. So the boundary line is really comes back to what I said at the very beginning about what expressive freedom is the right to speak, but also the right to hear. So you can protest somebody who you disagree with, you can criticize their views either in writing or verbally, but you can't prevent others from hearing them. That's when something moves from protest and criticism to censorship.
So it's fine to say that, I think that, person X is a terrible person and that his views are awful, and I can wave a placard and I can protest and hang out.
You can encourage people never to go listen to him. You can go to his event and ask difficult questions. You can protests outside of event, encouraging people not to go in.
But what if I and some can but if I and some like-minded folk who feel as I do, like hold hands and bar the entrance so that no one can go in to hear this person's terrible, awful ideas.
Or you pull out fire alarms or other kinds of things to stop the event from happening.
So that is a step too far. So there's no I've heard it referred to as the heckler's veto.
That's right. Well, you're effectively stopping anybody else who wants to hear that person from doing so. And people may want to hear that person because they're bitterly opposed to him and want to write a piece showing how he's misguided. There's an old aphorism that the best way to deal with speech you don't like is more speech, not the suppression of speech. So if you really disagree with the guy, you have a variety of options. You can write critical pieces about it. You can expose that person's views. You can encourage people not to go listen to them, or you can just boycott them and stay away from them, as I do when I walk across Ryerson's courtyard before the pandemic. There were pro-lifers with posters with pictures of fetuses and linking it to the Holocaust. So some people tried to get them thrown out of the campus, which they can't do. Um, but others go up and argue with them. I think the best way of dealing with them, I'm a strong pro-choice person myself, is just to ignore them, not to give them the attention that they obviously crave and want. But we have all those options, all those. But they have a right to point their view. They earnestly believe that abortion is murder, and by speaking out against it, by taking, and the extreme ones of them of actually shooting abortion doctors, is a form of their expression. Now there are there is no such thing as absolute free expression, and there are limits on free expression, and one of them is the use of violence or the advocacy of violence. But nevertheless, it's that kind of cauldron in which different views have to be tolerated uh, for a democratic society to survive.
Okay, so I think it's fairly I think it's fair to say that um, me punching you is not a legitimate form of free expression.
It's a form of expression, but it's not recognized nor protected.
Okay, so you're not a free expression absolutist. You recognize that there are.
I don't think there is such a thing. I don't think there is such a thing anywhere in the world as free expression absolutism. There are all sorts of limits, whether it's be violence or the call for violence, defamation, fraud. Uh, Even most municipalities have noise bylaws, so I can't play my sound system at 120 decibels at 3 in the morning. That's the limit on my expression. So there's all sorts of limits that our society recognizes as legitimate limits on expression.
So let's talk about a form of expression that has had very real consequences in the past couple of years. Over 30,000 Canadians have died of COVID-19 since the start of the pandemic, and we're at as we record this, we're at the end of December, and over 825,000 people have lost their lives to the virus in the United States. Vaccine hesitancy and anti mask obstinacy is fueled in large part by misinformation on social media and is certainly a contributing factor to those very large numbers of lost lives. So, if wouldn't laws or prohibitions against misinformation save lives? And if saving lives is not a reasonable justification for curtailing some forms of expression, what would be?
That's a very good question. Certainly, the obvious answer seems to be yes, but the reality is it doesn't work. The first law against what we now call disinformation or misinformation,
Or call them lies or untruths.
whatever, yeah, was passed in 1274 as part of the Statutes of Westminster and was a feature of Anglo British law until the 19th century when it was finally taken out of the law because it never worked. Because what is deemed misinformation? Misinformation is a very broad term. And what are the boundaries of it? So well, theoretically, it sounds like a good way to solve a problem. Empirically, it's worked so badly that most countries in the world have gotten rid of their disinformation laws because they haven't worked. Uh, Usually because they get terribly broad, uh, and it becomes a sort of who has power politically. Uh, for most, I mean, go back to my pro-life, pro-choice side. Most pro-lifers would see my position on pro-choice as disinformation. Um, that uh, it's just a lot of. I mean, there's a lot of. We were told a lot in the early days of the pandemic that we couldn't touch door handles and that it was spread um, by contact, which we now know is almost a trivial means. So that was actually misinformation. It wasn't intended to be misinformation, but we now know it to be misinformation. There are some serious scientists who continue to have concerns about the adequacy of the clinical trials that made certain vaccines uh, acceptable for use. These aren't anti-vaxxers. These are people who historically have been critics of the pharmaceutical industry developing new things and testing them in a haphazard way in order to sell them and get rich, as Pfizer and Moderna are at the moment, and raising questions. Now, insofar as those questions are potentially critical, pointing to potential long-term problems with vaccines, would that fall under what constitutes misinformation, or is the fact that they're serious scientists, as opposed to a group of people associated with some Pentecostal church in Southern California? Uh, does one get blocked? And I mean, there's just a host of these kinds of problems. So um, it's not that we don't want to get rid of disinformation or misinformation. It's how we do that. And making it illegal has never proven an effective way to do that.
Can we drill down a little bit that? So you've said a couple of times today that censorship doesn't work, and you've written elsewhere that it's usually counterproductive. So for like the one example that you mentioned earlier, Stalin backed Lysenko. He barred all other uh, views. The thing was is that that was actually very effective in the sense that by mandating only Lysenkoism could be taught, by barring views of evolution and the scientific consensus, which turns out to be accurate. He was wrong, and it led to serious erosion of the expertise, biological expertise in the Soviet Union. My point is, it was effective. The censorship of dissenting views. So that seems sort of counter to your argument. Can you give us some examples of how censorship fails and how it is counterproductive or how it doesn't work?
I mean, let's just take the example. Let's pursue Lysenko for a moment. It worked in the sense that in the police state that Stalin ran, you put your life at risk if you dissented from that view. And so Lysenkoism became the dominant understanding in biology departments in Soviet universities. But it failed in the sense that it had a devastating impact on the status and quality of biological science in the Soviet Union for 20 or 30 years. The harm it created far outweighed any potential benefit. Um, we can take lots of other examples. The Soviets tried to censor religion. They, were firm opponents of religious beliefs. They had enormous power, and yet it didn't work. I mean, religion is stronger in Russia today than it ever was. And despite 80 years of attempted censorship, it didn't end it. Uh, we have had histories of trying to censor various views in North America in the film industry. In the United States, there was the Hayes Committee that had to vet every film, and there were not allowed to be images of a married couple sleeping in a double bed. They had to be in two single beds. I mean, there were all sorts of restrictions for fear of what kinds of behavior. I mean, none of these things have proven very effective in the long run in terms of shaping human behavior. Um, and in the meantime, do a lot of harm. They did harm to the quality of the movies that were produced, uh, the ability to the attempt to stop misinformation, which has been and continues to be used by governments in various ways to silence opponents. Um, if you look at what's going on in Turkey right now, a lot of views that are opposed by the president are deemed to be misinformation. We see that in many countries around the world. Trump labeled virtually all of his opponents as spreading misinformation. The biggest misinformation that he claimed was spread was that Joe Biden won the election. Uh, so if you allow whoever's in power at a particular time to say, well, this is disinformation, cannot be spoken, cannot be circulated, you're applying what's in essence a political category that can have serious harm to the ability of the society to deal with the complex reality in which it finds itself.
Yeah, there's an old expression that says if the only tool you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail.
Yes.
So the real concern is that even if we were to use the power of the state to censor genuinely harmful ideas, that power would be used to also censor marginal ideas or questionable ideas, and then ultimately even good and healthy ideas.
Well, yeah, I mean, the most pernicious case, as Trump, I think, exemplifies, it would be used very explicitly to censor truthful, readily apparent ideas. And that's how dictators and totalitarian leaders have used it, that historically. The problem with the concept of misinformation, uh, when you try to define what is misinformation, you're inevitably going to make it either too broad, so it captures anything that those in power want it to capture, or too narrow, in which case it doesn't deal with it. And I can illustrate that better with regard to issues of racism. Uh, one of the leading African American intellectuals in the United States is Henry Louis Gates Jr., who is the head of the African American Studies Institute. I'm not sure that's the right title at Harvard. And in one of his writings, he talks about uh, being with some of his black students in Harvard Yard, and somebody comes by and shouts various expletives at them, the N word or whatever. And he said, that's that's easier for us to deal with. We see this as just a deeply hostile, racist person. In fact, what's harder to deal with is when one of their white friends comes up to us and says, "Oh, I'm so happy to see all of you here. Harvard is such a richer place because we have affirmative action policies that allow people like you to be here." Uh, he said that kind of thing that I guess we call microaggressions today is far more harmful. So if you want to censor racist speech, and you focus narrowly on what we all agree is explicitly racist speech, like calling somebody the N word or whatever, that's fine, but it doesn't do much. And if you try to extend it to all the things that could convey racist meaning, like that comment, which may have been well intentioned and the person may not even realize they're being racist, or even you're black and you're walking down the hall and someone comes along and says hi to each white person, but just doesn't say anything to you. They don't say anything negative. If you try to capture all of that, you capture so much that it's impossible to, and it so intrudes upon uh, the interaction that's necessary in a society. So inevitably, censorship is a problem in that sense. And whether it's with regard to what's racism or what's terrorism or what's misinformation, it is either too broad or too narrow. And that's at the heart of the problem.
So far today, we've talked largely in terms of free expression and censorship, in terms of government, in terms of laws and regulations. You spoke a couple minutes ago about the former president Donald Trump, And he was effectively silenced when a small number of social media companies kicked them off their platforms. Now, you can like him or loathe him, but that is, to my mind, de facto censorship, if even if it's not technically so. Does the concentration of power in a few private companies, completely unrelated to government laws, is that a source of concern, or is free expression limited to what the government does, and what the government laws and regulations and policies of government?
That's a really important question. Censorship, uh, our charter refers to what constitutional protections we have from the actions of government. The First Amendment of the United States refers to what governments can do to censor or not censor. In other words, they can't censor. But that censorship isn't just what governments do. Constitutional protections against censorship, constitutional protections for free expression, are protections vis-a-vis what governments can do to you or not do to you. But censorship can be undertaken by anybody, private or public. So, insofar as a certain employer or a certain social club, or uh, going back to my example, pro-life and pro-choice supporters, they're trying to censor the others. This isn't government acting. Anytime you try to prevent someone whose views you don't like from being heard, or when the church declares somebody a heretic, and if they're in a Mennonite order, kicks them out of the order, or going to the Spanish Inquisition where they put them to death. That isn't government acting, but it's most assuredly extreme forms of censorship. So censorship does not refer only to what governments do. Any silencing of someone, preventing them from speaking, preventing others from hearing them, is censorship, whether in the private or public sector. And it can be harmful. So to go to your specific question about Donald Trump's Twitter account being taken down, I don't know if his Facebook account was taken down or not. I assume it was.
Yeah, he was kicked off of both Twitter and Facebook.
That question actually leads to a really important area that I hope we can discuss, and that is, right now, so much of what's seen as misinformation, of harmful information, is transmitted by social media. And our government in Canada is prepared some legislation to deal with that before the last election. They didn't introduce it before the last election. They made clear that during the election campaign, this was a priority for them to deal with the online harms, as they referred to it, and committed to dealing with that in the first 100 days after they came to power. Their commitment to this was reiterated in the throne speech, and we know that shortly they're going to be coming forward with proposals to deal with online harm. And they made clear that part of the proposal is to turn to the social media platforms themselves to solve the problem. That when there's harmful information, content, whether it be misinformation or otherwise, uh, the social media platform, in the version of the proposal that I understand they're going to bring forward, says that someone makes a complaint about something, the social media platform has 24 hours to decide whether or not they're going to take it down. If they don't take it down, they have to advise the complainant that they're not taking it down, and the complainant can then go to a tribunal and force them to, or they have to advise the person who's complained about that they're taking his or her posts or a whole site down. So it's turning control of what has become largely the public space for conversation, which is what social media has largely become, putting control of that in the hands of the social media companies. They already have substantial control. And most of what you see or I see on Facebook is determined by the Facebook algorithm. Uh, so they have enormous power.
Can I make a prediction here as to what's going to happen if this becomes law?
Yes, please.
What's going to happen is that the companies are going to quite rationally look at the risks and rewards of various courses of action, and basically have a threshold by which, if we get a certain number, if we get more than X complaints about a particular post, we're just going to take it down because it's not worth the trouble of going through everything.
Well,
People are going to recognize that all it's going to take is 5 or 20 or 100 complaints about a particular post. Hey, that James Turk said something I don't approve of. I'm going to get 49 of my buddies to launch a complaint, and Facebook and Twitter are simply going to say, you know what, we've hit that threshold. We're just going to take it down, and Mr. Turk has been effectively silenced. So if you criticize the liberals or the conservatives, the partisans from the other party will be able to do that. You criticize a company, employees or PR firm will arrange for that. You criticize any kind of institution, a religious one, for example, or religious ideas, and adherents of that faith are going to report you, and it's really going to mean that very little survives. Is this a scenario that you see taking place, or am I doom mongering here?
I think you're absolutely right. And it may not even be a threshold of 50 people complaining. If someone who is known to be wealthy and litigious complains, it may only take one complaint, because in an environment where all the penalties, and the penalties the federal government is talking about here, if the platform does not agree to take down what should be taken down, then the penalties are up to 3 to 5% of their gross worldwide revenue.
So if the rational choice is, rather than take that risk at the first complaint, just take it down.
Well, yeah. So that's right. There's no question. We're seeing that already in the legislation in the EU, which was passed in 2014. It's called the right to be forgotten, and it gives people the right, if there's something that is on the internet about them that they think is wrong or unfair or badly outdated, they can ask that it be taken down. They can ask Google to take it off their search engine. So the fact that it may still exist on the internet somewhere, you'd never be able to find it. It's like going into a library whose card catalog has been thrown out the window and trying to find a book when there's no indexing system where all the books are just heaped in a big pile. And you can, so, and what's happened there is when there are requests to take things down, of which there are hundreds of thousands, it's just easier for Google in most cases to comply with the request. Because if they don't comply with the request, then there's all sorts of appeal and litigious procedures that can be followed. And that would be the same under this. So there would be severe penalties if they don't act on something that at the end of the day a court or an appeal tribunal or a regulatory body says they should have taken down. So all things being equal, they're going to take it down, just as you're suggesting. And that's precisely the problem. Uh, and that approach is very popular. There was a survey done in Canada 2 weeks ago, I think, showing about 75% of Canadians supported that approach, because people are really troubled by all the harmful content that's in social media, the trolling of individuals, the disinformation about the effects of COVID or the effects of vaccines or whatever. We're all troubled by that. And so there's a desire to do something. So the government is under enormous pressure to do something. And so the something that makes sense on the surface, although it's deeply flawed, is to say, well, we'll have these companies just take down the bad stuff, which is, as I said before, turning these companies into society censors. And it's not going to work, first of all. Donald Trump may have been taken down from Facebook and Twitter, but I'm afraid his ideas are still being heard effectively. Alex Jones and all sorts of others are still being heard, but it doesn't work. But in the meantime, it means we don't look at real ways to solve these problems. We do have a problem with hate speech, and we do have a problem with misinformation, uh, and pretending that the platforms can solve it by taking things down diverts us from addressing things that might work. And the starting point for what might work includes a number of things, one of which is the platforms themselves. Facebook and Twitter and Google make their money by selling ads after scraping information from all of us. And for them to be able to do that, we have to spend time on their site. So they do everything possible to maximize the amount of uh, time we spend on their sites. And they do that because they know that, I mean, they do that by having outrageous, hyperbolic, conflictual, contentious, argumentative content. That's what draws people. Contemplative, reflective, analytical discussions are not what draw people to Facebook or Twitter or whatever. So their business model is premised on creating the very kind of discourse that's harmful, and now that they're being asked to remedy.
So there's a real conflict of interest there. They don't care so much about hateful content as such. What they care about is maximizing the time we spend on their sites. And it turns out that the really noxious stuff is what maximizes our time, as you write the furious reply to the crazy ideas that someone has just posted.
Right. Well, and this isn't a new realization. When I was young in Canada, I watched the CBC. Sometimes I'd watch the Buffalo news. And I was always amazed watching the Buffalo news because it was all about fires and murders and muggings and robberies. Uh, and I wonder, why is that? Well, because that's what draws people. I mean, the news media figured out that years ago. Uh, and Google and Facebook and Twitter have perfected that into a business model where they become the largest and most powerful controllers of the public arena in the history of the world, and have grown incredibly rich in the process. And now we're saying, well, this is a problem, and we want you to fix it by taking stuff down. Well, that let's approach it a different way by saying, let's force them to change their business model.
I can already hear the counter argument that my business model, I'm Twitter or Facebook or Google, I'm a private company, and my business model is my, like, literally it's my business. And I this type of government intervention is not only uh, in violation of, running a free market capitalist economy, but it's a it also goes against what's important to you, free expression. My business model as a social media firm or as an internet search company is a form of expression that my company partakes in. So I'm asking you, Mr. Free Expression, to justify the government intrusion on how I wish to express myself as a company and as a business model.
Well, we have a long history of the regulation of private business. Pharmaceutical companies are not free to just make whatever drug they want and sell it to Canadians or Americans or anyone. There has to be approval from the FDA in the United States or Health Canada after detailed clinical trials to show that this new medication is not harmful, doesn't cause people to die. There's regulations on cars, or there's regulations on toys. A manufacturer of toys is not free to use lead paint or to use toxic plastics in the making of the toy. So, in that sense, we've always had, not always had, we have a recognition that there's a public interest that needs to be protected, and that the free flow of the capitalist market is not the best way to do that. That there has to be some uh, public regulation of what these private organizations can do and cannot do. And we struggle over what are the boundaries of that. And over the last 25, 30 years, we've been in a less regulated mode. Uh, we, the asbestos companies fought successfully for years against regulation of the use of asbestos. And as a result, tens of thousands of people died and hundreds of thousands developed very serious illnesses. So we always struggle about what are the limits to which we can regulate or limit the free actions of private actors. But there's nothing that's contrary to that tradition of saying to the big media platforms, what you're doing has some wonderful elements to it, but it also has some very harmful elements. And we want to regulate you in a way to minimize those harmful elements. And there are a number of ways to do that. Uh, the kind of business model that they have and the size they've grown to be makes them the most powerful corporations in human history. Uh, Currently, 75% of all advertising dollars for all media in Canada go to Google and Facebook. So there's virtually no opportunity for competition. And if someone is able to develop something, they get swallowed up. So Facebook bought Instagram, Facebook bought WhatsApp. These were budding competitors. So we have these enormous, powerful, and you and I don't have the ability, if some new platform comes along, switching to it because all our friends and all our data are on Facebook. So another thing could be done is to give us control of our own personal data. And if we want to move it somewhere else, we can. And Facebook can't block us from doing that. There's all sorts of measures that could be taken to diminish the control that a handful of private actors have over public discourse.
Yeah, I've heard this concept referred to as competitive compatibility.
Yeah, I don't know that term, but that makes sense. It's in the context really of old antitrust legislation. There's recognition that when an entity becomes so large and so powerful, it becomes the market, and therefore there can't be any challenge to it effectively because no one can get big enough to challenge it. It's now no longer a competitive environment. And we've seen that with the demise of most of the traditional media in this country. You look at Post Media News, this chain of newspapers across the country is in such dire financial shape that they probably have the equivalent of one newspaper staff amongst all their newspapers across the country. There are whole communities as large as Guelph, Ontario, for example, that have no newspapers any longer, have no radio stations. It's very hard for any of the traditional media to even exist in the monopoly world of Facebook and Twitter. So the thought that the problems that they've helped create by their size, by their scope, by the kind of communication they privilege and what they encourage on their sites, their business model, can be solved by asking them to become the censors to stop this stuff is a ludicrous idea from my point of view.
So that's interesting because an implication of what you're saying, it seems to me, is that monopolies or oligopolies, a small number of firms that control an important part of society, is bad for free expression. Like the actual existence of monopolies in a country is bad for free expression.
Especially when those monopolies or oligopolies control the public place for discourse. It's one thing to say that uh, a collection of large petroleum companies or a handful of large pharmaceutical companies is harmful, as I would argue it is, because new ones who want to develop other drugs or other approaches, drug companies just don't want to do research on sleeping sickness, for example, or other kinds of disorders that primarily affect poor people in the South because there's not much money to be made by doing that. So there's all sorts of problems with a handful of major pharmaceutical companies controlling the making of drugs in the world. But that's problem is a, what exists with the big social media companies, the big tech, is even worse because there is what it's controlling is that forum for public discourse, um, and so they can shape every aspect of our lives by how they control the public discourse. and they already have too much power. So turning to them to help remedy some of these problems is only giving them more power. And the incentive, as you suggested, would be to shut things down if there's a contest about it, because they make themselves less vulnerable.
Yeah, just a very. This reminds me of a very specific example of corporate power, monopoly power, stifling free expression. I think it was about 3 years ago. Canadian humanist Richard Thane wanted to he wanted to pay for a billboard to and with the message that drew attention to the discriminatory education funding practices in Ontario and Alberta, where the government funds in Ontario in full and Alberta in part for sectarian religious schools out of the public purse. And the company refused to run the ads. They claimed that it violated their internal code of standards and refused to put them up. Uh, and they basically have a monopoly on outdoor billboards in both in both cities. So uh, corporations, they don't have a legal responsibility to protect free speech, do they? Do you feel that they have a moral obligation to do so?
Well, they don't have, I'd say it more generally, private corporations don't have an obligation to act in the public interest. Their obligation is to generate revenue for their shareholders. And oftentimes, the best way to do that is to act in a way contrary to the public interest, whether you're an asbestos company um, or otherwise. Uh, and so, what regulation is about is constraining their choices so as to increase the likelihood that they're going to act in the public interest. Uh, and I mean, I think it's as simple as that at its heart.
Yeah, even defining the public interest would be an entire other episode, if not a whole series of discussions.
But in a democracy, that's what free expression makes possible, is that discussion of what's in the public interest. As I said at the very beginning, I think what democracy fundamentally is about is an ongoing public discourse about what's legitimate and what's not legitimate. And anything that shuts down that discourse is fundamentally harmful and is fundamentally anti-democratic and fundamentally harmful to the democratic project. Democracy is not something we ever fully achieve. It's a process. It's an ongoing way of being that offers our only hope for not being controlled by some set of powerful interests.
I agree. Democracy is a lot more than an election every 4 or so years.
Absolutely, and democracy is often imperfect, as Winston Churchill is alleged to have said, although I don't think he ever said it. Democracy is the worst form of government except for all the others. Um, that it's imperfect in all sorts of ways, but it holds out the possibility, the hope, the possibility that the direction we're going on any particular matter can be changed through public discourse and public organization and the freedom rights that are reflected in our charter of freedom of the press and freedom of association, the public's right to know, freedom of assembly. Those are all that give us the hope of not being under somebody's thumb, whether it be the government's thumb or Facebook's thumb.
So let's pull back for a bit. I think we can both agree that terrible views like racism and misogyny, religious bigotry, these are not new. They've been around essentially forever. In your opinion, has our shift in the public discourse to online platforms, and particularly social media, and the rise of online trolls, is it is this essentially the same struggle against prejudiced folks as it ever was, or have the dynamics changed that make the racists and the religious bigots and the misogynists worse than it was? The views aren't new, but are they being given more attention? Are they more dominant in public discourse? Are they having a larger effect now than they used to? Or are concerns simply blown out of proportion because of how visible they are on social media?
If one looks over the history of new communications technologies, each has posed serious challenges. So the rise in anti-Semitism after the invention of the printing press was great because the printing press made it possible to disseminate anti-Semitic views at a scale and in a way that had not been known previously in human history. With the introduction of radio and then television, there was the ability to transmit views far more extensively than before. And it provided a platform, an opportunity for those with racist or homophobic or any kind of other views to have them shared more broadly. So what social media has changed, as you say, none of the views that are being expressed are new. The hatred against women, transphobia, homophobia, Islamophobia, anti Semitism, none of that is new. The claim of fake news. Uh, there's Sophia Rosenfeld, who's a professor of history at the University of Pennsylvania, wrote a really interesting book called Democracy and Truth. And this was in the midst of the Trump years. She wrote this saying, look, all this stuff about fake news is not new at all. And this attack on the media, and has a quote from George Washington in the latter part of the 18th century that sounded like Donald Trump when he was talking about the media and what the media were doing to him. Uh, so none of that is new. What social media has done on a scale unknown in human history is allowed for both the amplification of those views and the expression of those views. So now you can be some person in a basement in Kazakhstan with racist views or anti Semitic views or Islamophobic views and have them heard by hundreds of thousands of people or millions of people worldwide. We've never had that capability of disseminating views as broadly and as forcefully as social media makes possible. So that's what we're wrestling with. How do we cope with that? And some of the characteristics of social media that are essential to its most positive aspects also make possible its most terrible aspects. So the anonymity that's possible through social media, which allows dissidents in totalitarian and repressive states like Saudi Arabia or Russia or Yemen or Iraq or wherever to speak out, also allows hateful white supremacist trolls to attack women journalists or progressive people of one sort or another. And we don't know how to stop one without stopping the other. So that's what we're wrestling with at the moment.
Yeah, can we talk about that a little bit more, because one of the most compelling arguments that I've heard in favor of us needing to do something to curb free expression comes from women, female journalists who are just doing their jobs, and whenever they report on something even the tiny bit controversial, at least to somebody, and almost everything is controversial to somebody. I've read dozens of accounts of how they receive unwelcome and aggressive speech or emails or posts about them on social media, attacking them personally or the color of their skin, certainly their sex. If they happen to be not Christian, then attacking their faith, or you're only saying that because you are, a Jew or a Muslim or whatever. And to say nothing of what I think crosses or what should cross a legal line of death and rape threats that apparently are endemic, and they're calling out for some form of protection because many are leaving the profession because they cannot handle the torrent of abuse that comes their way every time they do their jobs well. And I am very sympathetic to that. I'm also sympathetic to everything that you have said today. And I'm struggling with how to reconcile those two perspectives. And I would really appreciate your perspective on that.
Well, I share your view entirely with how horrific it is that women journalists in this example are victims of really vicious behavior often. Uh, it's just we're not sure what we can do about it. Uh, one of the things, one of the old cliches, which I'm afraid is true, that once something's on the internet, it's there forever. So Twitter can shut them down, and then they go to Reddit or they go somewhere else. It's like a game of whack-a-mole trying to stay on top of it. Having internal content moderation, as Facebook tries to do, is the scale. It's the scale at which these social media platforms operate make it almost impossible to know how to deal effectively with this. There are, I don't know how many billion posts a day on Facebook in 300 languages. How do you stay on top of that and get rid of the harmful stuff? How do you get it's they say, well, we use algorithms, we use artificial intelligence to sort this out, but there's not been any way to figure out how to look at the context, which would make a comment either noxious or actually beneficial.
Yeah, I am not aware of any algorithm that can tell the difference between here's Leslie saying a racist thing versus here is Leslie reporting on somebody saying a racist thing versus here is Leslie arguing against a racist
Precisely.
thing that someone has said. Because racist things are in all of those, but as you said, like the context is very different for each.
So some people's solution to that is, and we've seen this in universities, that you can never make reference to the N word. And so whenever it's used as an expletive, obviously that's requires disciplinary action. But when you use it in the context of, one professor at Queens got in trouble. He was teaching a course in post-colonial history and was illustrating the legacy of racism by quoting from the transcript of a trial of the admiral in charge of Pearl Harbor, who knew 3 days ahead of time they were told they were going to be attacked. He ignored it, and then he was court-martialed. And he in his court in the professor was trying to illustrate how racist ideas have a long life. And this admiral made some derogatory comment about, well, how could all these yellow jap bastards be thought to ever have any ability to really attack the United States? So I just ignored them. And he quoted from another transcript of a colonel in Afghanistan who was court-martialed because there had been a warning that a base was going to be under attack, and he just ignored it. And he made a similar derisive comment about Afghanis and who would have thought people, and use some epithets to describe. And so this professor was simply quoting from these transcripts to illustrate the perils of racism. Some students complained, and he was removed from his job. So the lack of recognizing the difference, the difficulty of recognizing the difference between the use of it as an expletive and the use of it descriptively or analytically leads some people to say, well, we won't allow that word ever to be used, period. We won't allow any racist language to be used, period, even if what you're talking about is how harmful racist language is. Um, and that solution is a terrible solution because, as you said, almost everything is found to be controversial by somebody or other. And so we want to get rid of all controversial or hateful or what are deemed to be hateful remarks as opposed to genuine hate speech. We would not have a whole lot we could talk about. So going, your central question is, what do we do about those women journalists who are faced with this horrible stuff? And it's not clear. A lot of what they face is done anonymously, so we can't even identify where it comes from. Almost all that's done to them is already illegal, threatening them with violence, harassing them in ways, which meet the legal test of harassment. A lot of the racist stuff is clearly in violation of human rights laws. It's not that it isn't already illegal, it's we don't know how to stop it. And saying we're going to make it illegal in yet one more way is not going to be a very effective way of stopping it. Uh, we really have to. Most of social behavior is not controlled by the law; it's controlled by norms and mores and traditions and cultures. And so it's an overly simplistic solution to a very serious problem, saying, well, we're going to fix it by making it against the law. We'll just pass a law and that'll take care of it. Well, as I say, these things are all against the law already, or most of them are, and that's not taking care of it. So we have to grapple as a society, I think, with the harder problem of defining those kinds of behaviors as simply unacceptable. Most traffic laws are respected to the extent they're respected, not because there's a cop on every corner following you all the time, but just because you've internalized that this is important socially, that we have certain things we do. We stop at red lights, we stop at stop signs. Even if it's 2 in the morning, you're out in the country. Uh, we have to find ways of, as a society, coming to recognize that these deeply harmful behaviors are so unacceptable that they have to be socially and culturally uh, verboten in a way that I mean, there'll always be some people who do it, but it'll be marginalized. And we have to take away some of the tools that these folks have to do it. So creating more competition, taking away, changing the business model of corporations that reward this kind of behavior, and so forth, are part of the solution as well.
You partially answered where I was just about to go. We've been going for a while, and I want to respect your time, and I want to thank you. I could probably talk to you. There's a whole bunch that you have mentioned that I want to delve deeper into, but I think that a 10-hour discussion is maybe a little bit too much. So I've got two questions left, and you
Okay.
just partially answered the first one that I have, and that is if we've spoken a lot about the importance of free expression, and that and a lot of the things that the government is doing wrong, specifically with the latest. Well, we don't know what the legislation is, but they've promised something. If it were up to you, you we would enforce antitrust laws. We would regulate social media in the public interest. What positive steps, what actions would you have governments take to both protect free speech while minimizing the harms that we are seeing right now?
Well, there are several things. One is insofar as certain kind of speech is uh, forbidden by the law, governments have to be very precise as to what falls in that category and what doesn't. Since hate speech laws were introduced in Canada in the criminal code a number of years ago, courts have been very judicious in trying to ensure that what's deemed hate speech doesn't become so overly broad to be equivalent to what someone finds offensive. Um, that there's a recognition that any limits on freedom of expression, which there always will be some, have to be as narrowly and precisely defined as possible, lest you not undermine the ability of a society to have public discourse, individuals to find themselves and develop themselves, knowledge to be advanced. So you have to make sure that the restrictions are never overly broad. And that means terms like misinformation or hate are truly troublesome terms. And terrorism, in 2001, 2002, when the Anti Terrorism Act was being brought in, there were a lot of us who were deeply concerned about it because terrorism is, at the end of the day, not a legal concept, but a political one. And one person's terrorist might be another person's freedom fighter. Uh, and so you give this vague ability, I mean, this vague term that governments can apply as they want. And that's a problem in a democratic society, especially when everything that was defined as terrorist was already illegal. And so finding ways to be as precise as to avoid the use of overly broad terms, to be precise in what you mean by them is part of the solution. Another part of the solution, as I said, is trying to diminish the monopolistic powers of the handful of giant social media companies. So giving people the right to control their own data so that you would have a legal right to go to Facebook saying, I'm switching over to this new provider and I want everything you have on me to be taken out of your files and given to them and erased from your files. So if you and a bunch of your friends wanted to go to this new provider, you could just do so. Uh, that that would help undermine the overwhelming control that these one or two giants have. And there's a variety of things like that that can make a difference. But we also have to have a discussion as a society of what we are prepared to keep tolerating. I remember, in the early days of anti-racist struggles, all of us were told that, one of the more powerful things you do if you're in a group of your friends and somebody tells a racist joke, for you to speak up and say, I find that offensive. I'm white, but I find your use of the N-word, or I find your derogatory comments about people who are black to be deeply offensive. Uh, there's got to be action at that sort of level. So there's a social price to be paid. You don't just worry on calling the police and having the police come and charge them, and then you get, when the key hate speech case, one of the earliest ones in Canada, was a guy named Jim Keekstra, who was a high school teacher in Eckville, Alberta, was a virulent anti-Semite, required his students to speak to feed back his anti-Semitism, and was fired. And then 2 years later was charged under Canada's hate speech law, and he was before the courts for 12 years before the Supreme Court finally decided in a 5-4 decision that he was guilty of hate speech. Um, I just don't think that legalistic approach is the most effective way to deal with the problem. And so we have to, so saying that means then we have a real obligation to have that difficult discussion about what other options do we have. And nobody wants to spend a lot of time in that difficult discussion because they want quick fix solutions, and there are no quick fix solutions. After the printing press was introduced, it took about 80 years to figure out how to manage this new thing in a way that the harms didn't outweigh the benefits. So it's the conversation, as you're encouraging me to have right now with you and you're encouraging others to engage in, is, I think, a central part of the solution. We as a society have to say, this is a serious problem. There are no simple answers. That doesn't mean anything goes. It means we have a special obligation to try to come to grips with what this is, the harm it's doing, and how we can counter it.
Once again, you anticipated my question, because my last question was going to be, assuming that the people listening to this podcast are broadly sympathetic to your perspective, what would you recommend the actions that they take, like outside of government? But I think you've largely covered that. Is there anything you want to add?
No, I think in part it's accepting that these problems are all of our problems. It isn't a problem of all of us just individually being flawed. We have systemic racism in Canada. We have systemic homophobia. We have systemic transphobia. It's a huge problem to deal with. And we have to look at all sorts of ways in which we can do it where we don't create new harms of equivalent seriousness. And where we take some personal responsibility for our small bit in this. Like, as I say, you're a group of friends and somebody tells a racist joke, to have the courage in that setting to say this is unacceptable. It's fine to be outraged over what Alex Jones has to say or Steve Bannon. It takes no courage to speak out against that. But if your best friend tells a racist joke and you have to publicly confront him over it, that's much harder to do. But those are the kinds of things we have to do. Every time we allow a racist joke or to go uncommented upon, we're contributing to the racism in our society. So there is part of that personal responsibility we have to take, while also understanding it isn't just a matter of personalities. It's a structure in which we have to deal with the flawed criminal justice system, the economic and social inequality in our society, the poverty and the inequitable characteristic of who's poor and who's not. And how do we address all those things? Because a real solution involves all of that. And that's much harder to do than saying, well, we're going to pass this law, or we're going to let Facebook solve the problem by deplatforming people.
Well, we've got a lot of work ahead of us. Any last thoughts?
No, I appreciate. I just want to again thank you for the opportunity to be on this show with you.
James Turk, this has been a great conversation. Thank you for taking the time, and thank you for appearing on Podcast for Inquiry.
My pleasure. Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode. Links for today's discussion can be found in the show notes. If you enjoyed today's podcast, please subscribe and engage in the conversation. Comment, rate, and review. We'd love to hear your perspective. The Podcast for Inquiry is brought to you by the Centre for Inquiry Canada. We rely entirely on donations to be your voice supporting science, free inquiry, critical thinking, and secularism here in Canada. To our supporters, thank you. If you have not yet contributed, please consider making a donation at centerforinquiry.ca/donate, or becoming a member for only $30 per year at centerforinquiry.ca/join. Your support will help make it possible for us to continue making our collective demand for reason and evidence-based decision-making everywhere. CFIC is on the web at centerforinquiry.ca. Find us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter at CFI Canada. Podcast for Inquiry is produced and edited by Matt Payne, Nikolay Nikitushkin, and Martin Zelinsky. Music by Anthony Luzaro. See you next time.